Hello and welcome to something a little bit different on the channel. Still F1 Manager, but it's focusing on some tips and guides. I've been asked from the community to do a couple of episodes on practice setup as well as design stroke research. So the first of those today is the design stroke research. That's what we're focusing on. And if you can do all of that lovely stuff in terms of subscribing to the channel if you're not already, and please do like the video if you do like this content. But let's jump straight into this. So in terms of car parts development and research. Now, I am by no means an expert. I'm not claimed to be so. So if you want a definitive breakdown in depth, going through every little detail, that's not what this video is for. This is purely me telling you how I do things, and it works out very well for me normally. So it's beneficial to me in terms of how I play the game, and it's always been successful, but it's not to say that this is the best way of doing it. Now, what I've done here is I've switched over to a fresh save just to go through the design elements first of all. So I would say the key things here is when you start a fresh season, when you start a new season or a new save, you're going to focus on design. So research is not even going to be available, and it's all going to be about design. And in terms of that design, I'll always design every part of the car, but you do want to focus on those that are going to give the most benefit to where your car starts. But what I would suggest is the underfloor. I always find the underfloor is the main element of the car. And what you want to look at here when you're designing parts is on the right hand side, you've got your car performance. So this will tell you where you are currently and what your gain is going to be once you put those designs on. But you can flick that through to see your rank on the grid. Now, this will also show highlighted areas. So in terms of the underfloor, side pods, it will show the areas that are affected by that part. Okay. Now, the main thing on F1 Manager, been like this for the last few years, is cornering is king, really. So these are the focus areas, really, of your design work and your research, but of course, design work, which we're focusing on now. You want to really focus on low speed, medium speed, high speed. They are the main three. If you can get those to first, you will be very competitive, and then you can work on these other ones around it. So that's what would be my advice. And as I say, start with the underfloor. And we're not going to go through every design here, but of course, if that would be beneficial, I'll be happy to do another video on that. This is just an overview of how we tackle design and research. But for an example on the underfloor, when you go in here, there's a couple of things as well. So CFD and wind tunnel hours, this is going to gain you expertise. So where you are doing a significant upgrade, you might wish to, for example, on the underfloor, put a lot of hours into this, because that's going to really give that part a big buff. So for example, if you've just started a new save, or you're into a second season, but it's your first design work, you might want to do something like this, which is very heavy on the underfloor, because it's going to give you a really big buff. So whilst I'm talking there around a buff and a boost to expertise, it's worth just briefly explaining what expertise is. So expertise is how good each aspect of each part is. So we're in a part in terms of underfloor, and then we've got these different aspects. So from drag reduction, low speed, medium speed, high speed, airflow sensitivity. You're building up expertise on each of these areas, and expertise, as I say, is how good that part is. Now, I don't as such get bogged down in the numbers in terms of how much expertise you're gaining, because it's difficult to see in the low speed, medium, high speed because of the metric in which we measure it. You can see the percentage here, and you can see it here. But you've got this metric, so I don't get bogged down in the percentage. We'll look at it on the research screen. It will show when you've got a new regulation change. It will show your deficit and what you're gaining against it. That's the main thing to look at, and we'll look at that as we get into research shortly. So with expertise, the longer you do a project, the more expertise you get. So we'll look at that as well in my recommendations on how many engineers you should put on a project. But the longer you have them on it, the more expertise you gain. And these effectively boost that. And each unit, I think, acts as a metric of a day in terms of expertise. But again, don't really need to get bogged down in what they actually represent. It's just seeing the boost that they provide. So as you can see, this currently is what we would have. But if we go back to this boost, you can see these numbers going up here. And that is what the expertise is doing. So we're increasing this, which is increasing our expertise. But if you take away all of that terminology, expertise, but what it means by increasing these is you're increasing the performance of the new part that you're designing. And more importantly, you'll get that buff when you do the following designs. It's always worthwhile if you design, say, this underfloor. If we now go through this underfloor, as soon as this underfloor completes, I would do another one, and you'll see a magnificent boost on that next part. In terms of the design focus, again, this is your preference, really, and I'm sure there's other videos out there that you can have a look at on what the very best thing to do is, but I would focus really on the car performance. Low speed is always going to be beneficial on the underfloor, but again, a main top tip is you always want to bring down this minimum lifespan. So on every part that you're developing, always bring this down. Apart from the front wing, because I think front wing, when you bring it right down, it's sort of one, where you see this lifespan race, this gives you a guide how long that part is going to last. When you do it on the front wing, it will go to around 1 to 2. So you don't want to do it to the front wing. You want to go up maybe 1 or 2 on the front wing. But certainly on these underfloors, I'm quite comfortable going down to the bottom here. So this is going to last 2 to 4 races. And as you can see, by doing that, if you look on the right-hand side here in terms of the car performance, you'll see these increase by just taking this down. So it's not changing the performance of the car. All it's changing is that part is not going to last from the middle here 4 to 7 races. It's going to last 2 to 4. But if we focus on low speed, for example, we're gaining 0.003. Dropping that down to the bottom, that's now up to 0.017. But as I say, for something like an underfloor, I would go full on low speed and then medium speed. And then something like that, for example. So you might lose a bit on the top speed and airflow. But as I say, it's really focused on building up this low, medium, high speed. Again, it does depend on your car performance. So this is a new save, so this isn't the greatest. But if you are doing an underfloor and your low speed is already maybe first, second, third on the grid, but your medium speed is 9th or 10th on the grid, or your high speed is 8th and 10th, then you might want to switch this around a bit and not focus as much on the low speed. You might want to go for medium speed, for example. So it's all about your car and the focus that you need to focus on. But as I say, always prioritize low, medium, and high speed on all your car parts. Once you've got those to where you want them, whether that's first or maybe in the top 3, then you can focus more around your top speed and your other components here. Now, the final tip I'd give you on design is when you actually go to complete the design here on this screen where you've got your engineer size, you always want to stick with one engineer. And that's because the longer a project takes, the more expertise you get. So the buff of that when you do the next design work will be increased. And yeah, for some strange reason, if you have one engineer, obviously that takes longer to complete. So for example, it takes 33 days. You're getting 33 days worth of expertise. Whereas if you are putting all 6, you want to get it done quicker, which is naturally sometimes what you want to do. You'll get the part quicker, but you'll lose the difference in expertise there. So instead of 22, it's 33. So you lose 11 days worth of expertise. So unless you really need to rush through a part, I would advise not to do that. I would advise to put one engineer on it and a normal approach unless you've got the money to rush it through. But by standard, I'd always say one engineer for design and your research projects on normal, and that's the way to go. It is also worth noting that, as I say, we have normal, rushed, and intense here, and it goes back to the expertise conversation we were having. So expertise, as we've been mentioning, is gained daily. So by doing one engineer, this one, for example, will take 33 days. So we're going to get 33 days worth of expertise. If we done rushed, it will drop down to 22 days. So we're getting less expertise for it, plus it's costing 500,000 more. So it's worth it to do one on normal. This is what I would always do. Now, you do have a third option, which is intense. Now, to be fair, this does give you a good boost to expertise. It gives you an increase of 0.5%. But the con, to me, outweighs that, which is it costs 3 times as much. So intense for this design would be 3 million. Normal would be $1 million. So my recommendation, as I say, it's not to say it's the best way. Everything I do is one engineer on a normal approach. So just to summarize the design aspects that we've been through there, you can design any part that you wish. I would have a focus on underfloors the first part that you do and always come back to that. So in the early phase of the season, if you can get 2 or 3 underfloors done, that would be my preference. Rear wing and front wing also, I'd have those 3 as priorities, but also do develop chassis, side pods and suspensions. And as I say, where you can, look at the areas where it's focusing on high, medium and low speed until you get these where you need them. Ideally first, of course, but if it's your first season, you might just want to raise those to, depending where you are on the grid, 9th or 10th, for example. And if these other areas are, if we get these to 9th and 10th and these other areas are 18th and 18th here, then you want to focus on these areas, which, for example, top speed, you might want to look at a rear wing and you can then focus on those areas. But in summary, you can design all the parts. But first of all, you want to focus on low speed, medium speed, and high speed. You want to always put one engineer on that part. and a normal approach, and that's going to give you the best expertise for that. Now, the second part of that design element is research, and I'm always asked, when should I do research? What should I research? So there's the first thing here is research doesn't become available until you get a regulation vote, and that vote may not always be accepted, so there might not actually be any technical changes, but typically you'll see a regulation vote. Once you've had that vote, research becomes available. So it's within the first sort of 5-6 races of the season, research will become available. So until that point, you may as well focus on design because you can't even do research. Now, what to research? Now, that all depends on what your regulation changes are. So I can give you an example for mine, and this can always be found in your game as well. So if you do the regulation vote and you can't remember, now you can find those regulation changes when you're designing a part. So just for the purpose of this, let's just cancel that. So when you go into research, for example, each part that is affected will have a little sign here. So it will say major or minor. Mine for 2026, we've got it on everything. But it will give you a little warning there, and you can click into that. And when you hover over these, the elements that you're upgrading, you'll see in the middle here, this is the difference. So we talked about expertise earlier. Expertise is what you build up on that part, and the regulation changes that expertise. It gives it a reduction. So for DRS Delta, for example, next year, we're going to lose minus 70% expertise. And what your research does is it builds that expertise benefit back up. So minus 70%. If we research this part as is, we can obviously change the sliders. But if we research as is, we'll get 2.61% back. So in terms of what you should be researching, it's all around what your regulation changes are. Now, they can also be found, which is easier, I find, is at the bottom here. If you go over to board and then to the right, you'll have rules and regulations. So as I say, if you can't remember what you voted on, head over to here, and on the technical regulations, you'll see 2026 changes. And now the highlighted ones will be what's going to be affected. So if you're playing F1 Manager 2024, you will get a big regulation change in 2026 no matter what. But for, say, 2025 or 2027, it might be slightly smaller, and it might only be a couple of car parts affected. For 2026, as you can see in this example, every part is affected. So you click in again to those parts and it will show you what the difference is going to be, what the deficit that you effectively need to make up, okay? And again, you've got those on the front wing. And for us, it's on every part. But for an example, in your game, it might be that you've only got the side pods being affected and the suspension. And if that's the case, there are really the only two parts that you need to research. If these have not gotten a regulation change for the next year, I would not even research them. I would focus, you can still design those parts because it will carry over to next year because it's not being changed. So you're not going to lose your expertise for that part. So in terms of what should I research, only research, in my opinion and my experience, only research the parts that are being affected by the regulation changes next year. In terms of doing that research, it's the exact same process as we've been through already. So you'll get the same sliders, but what you'll see is as we said here, the car parts expertise, the reduction and the research benefit. Okay, so as I say, I'm not going to go through which slider is best and go into that detail. There are other videos available, I'm sure, for that kind of thing. That's not my style in terms of playing games. I like to figure out for myself. I probably do things wrong, but that's why I enjoy it. You know, you make mistakes, you learn from it, and you get better rather than just going on, finding a video. This is the best thing to do. This is the best setup. You know, it just makes it too easy. So if you're looking for that from this video, unfortunately, I'm not covering that, but I'm just giving you a few pointers of how I approach it. So again, research would be exactly the same as we've done design. Look at your car performance. Obviously, this is looking very good for us at the moment, but you might be lower again on high speed. So let's just say, for example, you're first on low speed, first on medium speed. Now, all of these parts, low speed, medium speed, high speed, we can see it's going to get a minus 70% reduction. So what you might want to do is if you're quite balanced on all of those, you might want to do a balanced approach for your research anyway. Just so you know, going into next year, your car is going to be exactly the same if you can make up that deficit. Okay. If, for example, your car and you're getting towards the end of the season and you've not done as much research on high speed, and high speed's where you're lacking anyway for this year's car, then you may wish to, in terms of the focus, you may wish to focus more on high speed, for example, and drop down some of the medium and low speed aspects. So for me, it's all about where your car is and what you've already researched. And to find that out as well, you will see car parts expertise that you've already built up, so it will be easier. It's just not showing on my screen. But say you've already done a front wing, which we're looking at here, let's say on high speed, it will show what you've already done in terms of your expertise. So if your high speed is, say, 10% for next year, but your medium speed is 6% and low speed is 6%, then you may wish to drop down the high speed and raise high speed and low speed. You can see what you'll be able to see that in the screen. It's just not showing on mine because we're early on in this research. But if you go back to the board rules and regulations and where we're looking at these technical regulations, I think we've done an underfloor. Yeah, so for example, we've done one underfloor research project. So this is the deficit for 2026, and this is what we've gained so far. So effectively what we're trying to do is build this up. It's going to be very hard for 2026. So if you do have 2026 regulation changes, it is difficult to make up the deficit. But where you've got only 2 parts being effective, as I say, maybe for 2025 regulations or 2027, then you can make up these deficits. So that's what you're trying to do. Combat these so you don't lose out on next year's car. You want to try and keep it balanced as well, so you're keeping these quite kind of even keel, really. Let's say if you've just got 2, say the chassis and front wing, you just need to keep going into this screen and you'll be able to see the sort of deficit and how you're building your research. And as soon as you've got your engine cooling to 60%, for example, so you're now beating the deficit, then you don't need to focus as much on that side of it. It might be more airflow middle, DRS delta, drag reduction. So you're just focusing on those elements. So again, just to summarize that, in terms of research doesn't become available until you get that regulation vote, and what you want to research all depends on what your regulations are. You'll be able to see that in the design screen, but you can also see under board, rules and regulations, under technical regulations. Those that are highlighted, they're the ones that have a change for next year, and you'll click into those and be able to see those. Only the parts that are being affected by the changes next year, that's what you want to focus your research on. And as I say, you're looking at each of these parts in terms of where the deficit is and focusing on those areas so next year's car doesn't have a deficit and you break beyond that effectively. So a short video, very different to what we normally do on the channel. And as I say, I'm not going through in-depth elements of the design and research work. It's just really to give you a flavor of how I tackle it. It's not to say that's the best way, it's the right way, but it always works for me. You know, in this Team Lotus series, we're on the lowest settings. We've gone from last on the grid in terms of no facilities, the car being 2 seconds off Q2 in the first race of 2024, to a season later in 2025, challenging for race wins after 4 or 5 races. So it works for me. It's the same in my McLaren series last year as well. I find it to be very beneficial. But do let me know in the comments if this was helpful. If you've got any questions, do let me know down there. And of course, if there's anyone watching that has got some tips, further tips for people, then do drop them in there. As I say, this is by no means telling you the best way to do it. It's just the way that CaliFlap does it over here. And we'll be back very soon. And we will be doing some more tips videos. So we'll have another one out soon, which will focus on practice and car setup. So stay tuned for that. If you're not already, do subscribe, like the video, and we'll be back very soon.